Hi guys, and welcome to another episode of Kabir Considers. In this video, I'm going to react to 7 myths that British people believe about America. Now, this is going to be an interesting one because there definitely are myths, I don't want to say misconceptions, but just things that we think, like things that we think of when we think of America. Like a popular one is probably the whole everything is bigger in America, right? Like whether it's cars, but particularly food. And I found this one to be mostly true, like especially in takeout restaurants. Like I remember going to, when I was last in Florida, we went to a few different Chinese restaurants, and the amount of food you get, like, is just mind-blowing. Like if you're getting something like a fried rice, like here you might get, if you ordered, let's say, king prawn fried rice, you'd get a little container, maybe that long and maybe that thick. But in America, probably times that by 3. It's really generous servings. I don't know whether that's because maybe food ingredients are cheaper, or I don't know what it is, but I actually quite like that. But there's probably other misconceptions too, other myths too. This video is by Lost in the Pond. He always does a fantastic job in these kinds of videos, so I know it's going to be a fun one. Let's do it.
Hello, this video is sponsored by BritBox, the premier streaming service for Britain's most beloved TV shows. I'm Lawrence Brown, and I'm on a quest to uncover all of the memos that Britain and America lost in the pond, and one of those memos pertains to myths. Specifically, myths that British people, including myself at one point, believed about the United States of America. But it is amazing what 14 years of living in the United States will do to your understanding and your perceptions about this very country. For instance, I learned early on that they don't have Cornish pasties, and I learned slightly less earlier on, so later, that Michigan has them. But I don't live in Michigan, so one way or another
I reckon you could probably find a Cornish pasty in most places in America, but it's probably just called something different. It's basically just like a pie, like in a semicircle shape with a thick pastry and some like carrots and peas in there. It's definitely, I reckon you could probably find it.
Still have to have them imported. A quick reminder that if you're not subscribed to this channel, you can change that fact about your life right now. But these myths go way beyond the absence of quintessentially British food. And so now that I've lived here for about a 1/7 of a century, it's time to outline some of the myths that us British believe about America and Americans.
Let's do it. Yeah.
This is a funny one because I think television gives us this notion that Americans do all live in giant houses like the McAllisters do in Home Alone.
Oh my God,
but it's not entirely the case. Sure, I mean, statistically, American houses are on average larger than their UK counterparts. There are a number of reasons for this, which I outlined in this video. But to say that all Americans live in really large houses is a complete fabrication of anything resembling the truth. And I was a good example of this before I became a YouTube sensation, because when I first moved to Chicago, we had to do things on a budget. Between me and my wife, we weren't making a great income, and this is a major city, so we had to sort of settle for an apartment whose dimensions were 300 square feet. And for those of you who don't know, that's about the size of a shoebox, roughly. You know, we had to leave our shoes outside the door. That's how small it was. And it is worth reiterating, I think, that the cost of living in the United States does fluctuate massively across the country. When I lived in Indiana, just one state over, we were paying about $530 a month. That's basically unheard of in Chicago. And it's certainly unheard of in New York City, which of course was the city in which the show Friends is set.
Could you even, for $500 a month, can you even find a bedroom to rent in New York City? I doubt it. And if you can, it's probably the tiniest room ever. Like, let me know.
And I think it's shows like that that gave us this impression that Americans were all living in big apartments. And speaking of houses, I was alerted to a tweet recently from a British person who couldn't believe that American addresses go way up into the thousands, and
It's because some of your door numbers are like 16358, or 1429. So we just assume that there's got to be 1,000 houses on the street.
Belief on this was that every street in the United States has thousands of houses on it. And this was a belief that I used to have. Because the country is absolutely massive, so you almost expect it to house that many people. But the thing is, there are way fewer people in this country per square mile than there are in Britain, so it doesn't add up. And that's when I got looking into it. And in a previous video, I outlined it doesn't really work like that. On any given street, they don't start at the number 1 and then end at 10,000. Often, and it's the case here in Chicago,
Right, okay.
you'll usually have a string of houses, for example, all in the 6,000s on a given street. And that's because it's about 6 miles from the center of downtown. 1 mile in from that, they're all 5,000s. Another mile, they're all 4,000s, etc., etc.
Okay,
Now, not
see.
every city in the US does it from the center of the city. It could be from another part of the city or just some other central point. But that's sort of a general rule for how the numbering works on US houses.
Okay, that makes sense.
This one comes up again.
This one is just dumb. Of course, America's got histories. You know, the country's like hundreds of years old. It's not like it just dropped from the sky yesterday.
And again, that the United States is such a young country that it basically doesn't have a history. And I've always thought of this perception of America to be quite a lazy one. Because even if you go back to 1776 through to the present day, yes, it is a short amount of time in comparison to the history of Britain. But think about all of the insane things that happened in that period. And even if you ignore all that, there's one thing that we tend to forget because we don't get taught it very deeply in Britain. And that is the thousands of years of native history that happened before we even turned up. I was absolutely blown away, not literally, that would be weird, when I went to Cahokia Mounds here in Illinois. Many, many hundreds of years ago, Cahokia Mounds used to be a native city, and it had about 20,000 people.
Are those all like teepees, or like they've got to be?
About 20,000 people, which might not sound like a lot by both American and British standards, but back in the day, that was more than London. And I once read about this volcano eruption that happened in present-day Oregon a few thousand years ago. And this eruption was witnessed and recorded by Native Americans who were in the area at the time. And long story short, they basically saw the origins of Crater Lake, which is absolutely huge. To be honest, both Brits and Americans love their myths. I mean, we've got the Loch Ness Monster, you've got a cryogenically frozen Walt Disney, and this new mystery on BritBox, Sherwood, has got
modern day Robin Hood.
Can we not do that?
Oh.
Like the Loch Ness Monster, I think somebody... what's that fish? Sturgeon. Because apparently sturgeons can get to like, I think 10 feet or some crazy size. Like, I think someone back in the day just saw a sturgeon and thought, oh my God, what the hell is that? Because I don't think there is a Loch Ness Monster. I think they just saw a big old sturgeon.
Start giving nicknames to wanted murderers and the press gets excited.
And I know what you're thinking. Ooh, Lawrence, why are you watching a gripping television show with your cat? Aren't you supposed to be editing this video? And the answer is yes. But you know what it's like. You sit down to watch just one episode of a really riveting show inspired by real-life murders and you end up binge-watching the entire thing. Trust me, I did the same thing with other shows like Line of Duty that are below. This one is embarrassing for me because years ago I believed that Canada and the United States were basically the same country. And the reason that I believe that is, number one, I was 12, so cut me some slack. And number two, my only sort of exposure to both countries was through the people, was through the way they spoke. And to my young ears, which couldn't yet differentiate these two accents, Macho Man Randy Savage and Bret Hart basically had the same accent, just with an entirely different timbre.
Wow, Macho Man Randy Savage. Haven't heard that name in a long time. I used to love wrestling. Who was my favourite wrestler? Probably The Rock. The Rock, I liked Triple H, Shawn Michaels, Eddie Guerrero. Who else? Anyway, I digress.
And that's all I had to go on. And I think it's what a lot of British people have to go on, because I still occasionally see those comments. Oh, what is the difference between Canada and America? Or is it essentially that one has Mounties and the other doesn't? And it's only since I moved here that I've become super aware of the substantial difference between the two countries. Completely different healthcare systems, completely different food, completely different use of English. Right, in Britain, we call it the loo. In America, they call it a restroom. In Canada, they call it a washroom. And I've seen all manner of different examples of that kind of thing. In America, they don't celebrate Boxing Day. In Canada, they do. The Canadian dollar is different to the American dollar. In some ways, they go with British English in places that America doesn't. And now that I'm older and I've listened to some of the regionalisms throughout the United States, even the way Americans speak is different to how Canadians speak. I'm not an expert on that, so I'm not going to go into too much.
Yeah, the Canadian accent almost sounds a bit like the Minnesota accent a little bit. Like E. I know that's a cliche, but it's hard to describe, but I can almost tell the difference now.
Detail, but these differences certainly go way beyond how the two countries pronounce the word about. I've touched on this before, but I couldn't really do a video without including it in this list. This perception that Americans are loud and boisterous. And I can understand on some level where that comes from, because I think the way Americans speak, it comes from a different part of the throat. So it's a bit more projected, right? Whereas us Brits, it's more sort of, I don't know, understated a lot of the time. I think another reason that we think Americans are loud is how they present themselves in films. There might even have been a time in my life where I thought all Americans were loud just because Jim Carrey was. He's Canadian, isn't he? He is Canadian. And culturally speaking, I definitely have found that Americans speak at a higher volume when they're in restaurants together. But there are so many other examples of the opposite being true. On match day, after we've had a pint or six, we're singing the songs of our team who we love because they happen to be situated in the town that we were born in. And it's just what we do when we leave a nightclub, which, I haven't done in 20 years. But when we did, I'd be on the street yelling at traffic cones because that might have just been me. But what I'm saying is, when we get drunk, we very much give Americans a run for their money. There's a loud...
For sure. When you, Brits, after a couple of drinks, the inhibition is gone. I mean, anything they were holding back when they were sober just comes way out. It's great. I like it. It shouldn't take booze, but sometimes people need a bit of liquid courage.
Person in all of us, right? And once we free ourselves of our inhibitions, we can let out all of the decibels we want. That's not a call to action. It's merely an observation. This is only funny, not because of the image of Americans walking around with bomb bags on, but it's because we call them bomb bags and you call them fanny packs, and it's bloody hilarious. It is also partly the visual, because bomb bags have never been cool, but this notion, which I occasionally read, that Americans are just always walking around wearing one, is very laughable, especially as somebody who's lived here 14 years. So it's quite dumbfounding, this one. I'm not saying that all British people think this way, but the ones that do, I'd be very interested to hear, do they think that way because they met an American in 1994 and they've just held on to that belief? Or are American tourists still wearing bum bags?
Honestly, the young lads these days in London, they all have them as well. So maybe it's an American thing that's come over here. But I can imagine they are quite useful. Sometimes a wallet isn't enough for all the stuff you want to carry.
I mean, do people carry cash?
Do you guys carry?
I can tell you this: I don't have a bomb bag / fanny pack radar. Right? I am not constantly surveilling the populace to see whether they do or do not have a fanny pack. But my feeling is, I don't remember seeing one in a while. So I think this is one very time-specific stereotype that can now be laid to rest. Right?
Yeah,
and yes, I thought I'd include one that was quite topical, not just because we are in the autumn, but also because I mentioned this fact on my YouTube short yesterday. Now, while for reasons that were laid out in that YouTube short, Americans prefer the term fall, I was surprised to find that the word autumn was pretty common among Americans. I don't know if this is a recent thing, like the whole country just woke up one morning and watched Lost in the Pond and thought to themselves, yes, we're changing things now. Or if it's just sort of always been here as an alternative to fall. And you might be thinking, ooh, Lawrence, aren't there many surprising word alternatives that Americans use?
Do you guys say fall or do you guys say autumn? Or do you use them interchangeably? Like here, it's definitely autumn. Nobody says fall. I can see why you would say fall because the leaves are falling, but yeah, it's just autumn. That
Brits don't know about, and the answer to that is yes. I merely brought this one up so I could make that very point. This is undoubtedly a pandemic era thing, but I've seen an increasing number of Americans using the word jab to mean shot. I once worked with an American colleague who liked to use the word bonkers. So in part because of the internet, just as Britain is taking on quite a few Americanisms, I think the same is true in reverse, and it will be very interesting to look further into those details. And those are just a handful of myths that some Brits believe about.
Super fun video as usual. Like a lot of the myths that he mentioned, as soon as he mentioned them, I was like, oh yeah. But like off the top of my head, like apart from the houses being bigger, like most of them, like I couldn't have named them. I do think for the most part, a lot of them are probably true to a degree. Maybe it depends. Maybe it varies state by state. Like the house thing, you know, for example, if you go to Texas, I think, or maybe more southern states where the cost of living might not be as high. So somewhere like New York, I reckon most houses are probably quite large. Whereas somewhere like New York City or Los Angeles, where it's really expensive, maybe houses are of a similar size as they are here. I don't know, really interesting video though. Thanks for watching guys, and I'll see you in the next one.